Hello, this is November the 10th, 2014. I'm here speaking with Alfred Uhry in the Richard B. Russell Special Collection Libraries of the University of Georgia. My name is Hugh Ruppersburg, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with Mr. Uhry about his work and his career. And I wanted to begin with a question about his play Last Night at Ballyhoo, which I had the opportunity to see last night. A group of students read the play to an audience. It was a very wonderful experience, and it's a family comedy of sorts. To say it's a comedy doesn't mean it doesn't have serious themes, and it's set in Atlanta in December of 1939. It's the night of the premiere of Gone with the Wind. We know that in the world history, Hitler is invading Poland, that World War II is revving up. And the timing of the play, when it's set, to me, seems very significant. Because one of the issues in the play are different attitudes towards Jewish identity that these people in the play have. And of course, what's going to come to light after World War II is over with are the atrocities and the nightmare of the Holocaust that took place in Europe leading up to World War II and during World War II. And it seems to me that if the play had been set after World War II, the whole question of identity would have been different. And I don't know whether I'm right or wrong. I'd just like to know your thoughts.
I think you're very right. I think the fact that Gone with the Wind happened to open in December of 1939, and Hitler happened to be invading Poland, and the war clouds were darkening, and there was this silly Jewish dance going on over that Christmas weekend, that it was a dynamite keg for a writer because there's so much rich stuff happening. And of course, the characters don't know about World War II, what's going to happen, so they're innocent. But they get to react the way I think people really would have reacted at the time. Some much more involved with who's going to go to the dance with who, some really involved in Gone with the Wind and all that Southern fantasy stuff, and some really involved with what's going to happen in the war. So there were those three elements going on.
And those of us in the audience watching the play know what's going to happen in the war.
Right.
Whereas people in the play do not.
Right, exactly.
Would you talk about your early life and what it might have been in your education or your early experiences that sort of moved you towards becoming a writer?
Yeah, I was born in Atlanta to a middle class, maybe upper middle class Jewish family. The roots of my family had been in Atlanta since before Atlanta was named Atlanta. 100 years when I was born, and I'm 78 years old, so now it's almost 200 years that my family's been in Atlanta. And they were very proud of being Southern, and at the same time, they were not quite, as one of the characters in that play says, they were up near the top socially, but not quite. They were aware that as Jews, there's certain places they can't go, there's certain clubs they can't join, there's certain things they're left out of. So they've gone about creating their own elite society and leaving out other Jews. So it's a tightrope they're walking on. And while I grew up, I was born before 1939, but a very, very small child. So I was writing about a time when I was a baby. But I knew how people felt then. And I've always thought as a writer, the time right before you're conscious seems to be so exciting and chic and romantic. And the pictures of people in all those clothes look great. So I was fascinated with the period. And a lot of that was easy for me to write because as a young boy, I was fascinated with Gone with the Wind and all that stuff, all that Civil War hoo-ha. And I have a character who is also fond of it all. And it was hard to recognize all that beautiful antebellum pride and the fact that we all got chills every time Dixie was played, with the fact that as Jews, we weren't accepted in that society. It was very hard to reconcile, very painful. And really people tried not to deal with it. And I found that a good thing to write about.
What led you to the idea that writing was a way that you could give expression to some of these ironies that you're talking about?
I think that I was born wanting to write, one way or another. I was born being very interested in people and in listening to people gossip or people talk, listening to my mother talk on the phone to her friends or my father talking with his friends. My parents were social. They had people over all the time. And I loved sitting on the floor playing with my trucks or whatever I had and listening to the grown people talk. I loved it all. And I loved the stories that were told about. Southern people tell a lot of stories. And these Jewish people seem to tell a lot of stories. So there were a lot of stories told about a lot of people. And people would get very worked up about which person was married to that person and who saw who at the party and who looked terrible and who looked good. And I found it just very sort of dishy and juicy to hear all that stuff. And I was very aware of who got their feelings hurt, and I just liked watching people and listening. And I always had an interest in thinking about that. When it turned into writing, it was very early, I'm not sure.
That kind of curiosity about how people talk about each other and family chit-chat and gossip, is that a characteristic of the Jewish family or the Southern family?
I think it's both. It certainly was a characteristic of my family. And my family was much more Southern than it was. Well, I don't know, Jewish can mean a lot of different things. And what we saw in the movies as Jewish, with Jewish people in the movies when I was young, were people who lived in very dark apartments in New York with heavy accents and called each other Mama and Papa. And my family wasn't all like that. It was much more of a typical Southern family. When you read the works of Flannery O'Connor and Eudora Welty, Carson McCullers and those people, my family was much more like that.
As you were coming along in your early years, your education, were there particular teachers or friends who sort of helped you along the way?
I had a teacher in the 6th and 7th grade. Her name was Miss Harrison. And I went to public school, Highland School. She was 6th and 7th grade. And Miss Harrison worked part-time at the Atlanta Journal. So she was very interested in newspaper writing. And she would take us down to the Journal and let us watch the papers roll off the presses and go in the press room and go here and there. And we started a paper at school called the Harrison Herald. And I was the editor. And I had a sports editor and a this and a society. And she let us do all that, and she encouraged us to write. She particularly encouraged me to write. And she saved my stuff. And she really, really, really helped me to want to be a writer. I mean, I was a little boy, so there was no, you're going to be a writer kind of conversation, but I had to do it.
Were you writing plays then?
I was. I was taking books like Tom Sawyer or Hans Brinker and the Silver Skates or whatever it was and turning them into plays, adapting. I liked doing that. They never got put on, excuse me, but I would write them.
Were there, you wrote, I believe, you were involved with a dramatic group about the time you were at Brown University?
There was a group at Brown. There were two. There was a group called, the Straight Drama Society at Brown was called Sock and Buskin. And every year they would put on 4 plays, and they would always do a Shakespeare play. And they did the classics a lot. And I took a course, a practicum course in theater, which met every afternoon, 4 afternoons a week. And we started with the earliest theater, the Greeks. We went on to the Romans and on to the medieval, on to Elizabethan, and it just awakened my interest in the theater. And also I fell in love with a girl in the class, and that awakened my interest in the theater too. And so I became very involved. They were doing a production at the Theater Society group of As You Like It. And the girl I was in love with was playing Celia in As You Like It. And I discovered what a wonderful play that was, and how funny it was, and how sharp. So it was my introduction to Shakespeare. Really, I mean, I'd studied in high school, but it was so boring I couldn't stand it. But I learned what a great writing it was, and I was falling in love with this girl, who I eventually married and am still married to, so that worked very well. And I started to love the theater. Actually, I started before that, but I wanted to be a part of the theater. I really did.
I've heard you talk about your fondness for musicals,
Yeah.
American musicals, and when and how did that develop?
Well, the first show I ever saw, excuse me, was a traveling production of Carousel when I was a little boy in Atlanta. And I thought it's the greatest thing I'd ever seen, and I wanted to be able to do that. I thought it was magic. And I loved going. My father was in the furniture business, and he had to go to New York twice a year. And when I got older, sometimes he would let me come along. And he didn't like to go to the theater much, but my mother did. So he got to stay in the hotel and sleep or whatever he did, and I got to go with my mother. I loved all the things I saw. And she loved the theater, and she took me to what she wanted to see. And she never explained anything, and so I just was taken along, and I loved it. I was hooked.
This would have been during the 40s or 50s?
40s and 50s, early 50s, yeah.
Well, that was a great period of American musicals,
yeah.
wouldn't you say?
Kiss Me Kate, South Pacific, Guys and Dolls, all those things. Saw them.
And when would you say that ended? That?
Well, they say that the pinnacle was probably 1956 with My Fair Lady. That the golden age of the musical theater was probably the 40s and the 50s. I mean, it's still going on, of course, but that was the high point. That was the great Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals and the Lerner and Loewe musicals and those things.
So what killed it, or what caused the decline in interest?
It's still going on. There are still musicals. The form got kind of used up, and they had to reinvent new ways to do it. And they have, and musical theater in New York is very successful now. But those classic musicals sort of ran out of gas after a while, and it took a while to reinvent the form.
Oh, I mean, I'm just curious because I'm fond of those old Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals. And what would be your, what would be a contemporary or recent musical you'd recommend to me?
I would say that the style has changed very much. And I would say if you wanted to see something that was funny and fresh, you might want to see the Book of Mormons, which is very different from Rodgers and Hammerstein, but it's an original musical with funny songs and a funny story. Or you might want to see the adaptation of Les Miserables, which is a big serious thing. Right. But there's still a lot of musicals.
You entered your career, at least early part of your career as a writer, involved writing musicals.
Yeah.
And I know you had some setbacks before you had some successes.
Oh, yeah.
Would you talk about the setbacks and whether they ever threatened to totally derail you, or how you got through them?
My first show was a musical adaptation of East of Eden, the Steinbeck novel, but more particularly the Kazan film that James Dean was in. It was called Here's Where I Belong. And it was slavishly patterned after Rodgers and Hammerstein, very serious musical. And it had a disastrous opening in Philadelphia where it got panned by the critics terribly. but with the wisdom of the producers, their lead producer was a man named Mitch Miller. Some people remember Sing Along with
Yes.
Mitch. Man,
It was that Mitch Miller?
It was that Mitch Miller. And in his infinite wisdom, he decided to bring it to New York, even though it had been just trashed in Philadelphia. We opened in New York and closed the same night. So that was a punch in the gut. And I started to teach. I was married young and I had children by then, 2 or 3. I have 4 totally, but this was they were still coming along. And I knew I was down, but I never consciously thought of, I'm not going to write anymore. And it wasn't this voice saying, I will get up and I will go. I just did it. I couldn't stop doing it. And eventually it occurred to me, after some years of writing these musicals, that I should try to focus on something I knew. And also, I liked writing the libretto part of musicals more than the lyrics. So I decided to write my first play about my family. And that was Driving Miss Daisy. And it was a big success. And it changed my life. I was already over 50 by then. But it changed everything. It was very successful, and you ran in New York for 2.5 years, or more, I guess. It got made into a film. The film won the Oscar. I won the Oscar. It was, high times. And I was, after I won an Oscar for writing a film, and the film won an Oscar, I was golden boy in the movies for a while. And I wrote a lot of films. Most of them didn't get made. But I got to travel around the world. I got paid well. And in fact, it really floated me so I could write more plays. I didn't have to teach anymore. And I found that as glamorous as Hollywood was, and as wonderful those trips were, and as wonderful as the money was, I just didn't like it very much. I liked writing for the theater. And you don't get rich writing for the theater. You can luck out sometimes, but there's no steady income. My wife has been a professor at Fordham in New York for many years now, and she's tenured, so she's there. But writers don't have anything like tenure or any guarantee of income. And I've managed since Miss Daisy to stay afloat. Sometimes it's a good year, sometimes it's a bad year. But the life of a playwright is not a life of ease. It's not a life of infinite riches falling into your hands. It's catch as catch can. And you have to love it. And you have to need it.
Did you enjoy your experiences as a teacher, or did?
I loved it. I loved teaching. I loved kids. I loved last night here in Athens when the students were reading my play. I like all that very much. It keeps you young to be around kids a lot. And I could see that I could have lived a life as a teacher happily. But this came in, and it was more exciting, and I did. I have always kept my hand in teaching. I do master classes, and I like working with young people.
I know you've done a number of adaptations, and you're currently, as you've said, adapting John Berendt's Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil for a stage
Correct.
play. But when you've adapted Welty's The Bridegroom and Josephine Humphrey's novel Rich in Love and your own play.
Yeah.
So when you're doing that, how do you determine what to do when you're taking someone else's work and trying to make it into something that to some extent you can call your own?
I
Where
think
do you
it's
strike
a skill
balance?
that you develop. And so you have somebody else's story, and you just kind of sort of think about, how do I see this? What would it be like if it was a film? What do I focus on? And you just sort of run the film in your mind. You can't just sit there and do it in an afternoon. It takes a lot of time to develop that, or to change a piece of writing into another form of a piece of writing. Is just a craft. and where to put songs in a musical, for instance, without ruining the story. It's an imagination and a very particular skill.
Do you feel, do you base your decisions on how to handle a particular scene on the quality of the source material? If the source material maybe isn't as good as you would like it to be, do you feel freer to rewrite and recalibrate?
I wouldn't change the intent. Mm-hmm. That would be wrong. I wouldn't want to do it if I had to change the intent or the basic premise of the thing. Changing particular details in it, perhaps. Strengthening things and leaving out other things and shaping it more for the stage or a film, you can do that. But what attracted you to you as suggested itself as a property for film or for adaptation to the stage is what the story is about. And you need to keep that.
There's a story about William Faulkner, who wrote the screenplay for The Have and the Have Not. And the story, I don't know whether it's true or not, is that Faulkner loved the title but hated the novel, so he just rewrote the story.
It was Hemingway, To Have and Have Not. And they just threw out the book and made up a whole thing for Lauren Bacall and Humphrey Bogart.
And at the same time, Faulkner's praised for The Big Sleep. But
right.
If you compare the dialogue in The Big Sleep to the novel, it's almost word for word.
The Big Sleep, apparently, when they wrote it, nobody knew what it was about. And they never knew what it was about after they wrote it. It doesn't make any sense. But it's delightful.
It is. You had a success with your adaptation of Eudora Welty's The Robber Bridegroom.
Right.
And would you talk about how you came to be involved in
I loved all of her work. And I used to hang around bookstores a lot, and one day I found that book. And I had thought I'd read everything, and I'd never even heard of that one. And I read it, and it just flew into my head. What a great musical this would be. And I was nobody. I was a young man with no credits. I wrote Eudora a letter and said, "Dear Miss Welty, I would like to try to turn The Robber Bridegroom into a musical." And she wrote me back and said, "Well, a lot of people have tried. It didn't work, but sure, go ahead." And I did. And we invited her to the first incarnation, and she liked it. And we kept going, and she was very helpful, and sent me on my way.
So she did see the final play. Though.
Oh yeah, she saw it a lot. She came a lot.
In general terms, as you think about what you'd like to be doing at a particular moment, how do you choose what to work on? Where do you get ideas for a new play?
I can't explain it. I can only say something seems like a good idea or it doesn't seem like a good idea. And sometimes I get cold on it and sometimes I don't. And I don't know where it comes from, the inspiration. It just seems like, oh, that works for me. I don't know why.
Are you worried when you don't have something to work on or something?
I'm restless.
Okay.
I'm not happy.
You talked about not really enjoying the Hollywood life, by which I take to mean the involvement in films or writing screenplays for films. And what's the difference between writing a play and a screenplay?
The difference is control. In the theater, a writer has control of the material. In the film and in television, you sell the material to them and they can do whatever they want with it. So they can change anything. They can hire somebody to rewrite what you write. They can hire my 10-year-old grandson to write it if they want to. Do anything they want. So you never have the control. I was lucky with Driving Miss Daisy because I did have control and I was in tune with the director. But often they just do what they want. And I didn't feel like a writer.
So when you took the play, Driving Miss Daisy, and you thought about adapting it into a screenplay, what changes did you make? I mean,
Well, eventually I learned I had to cut half the dialogue because they didn't have to talk as much. If a camera's right up in somebody's face, you can see the way their mouth works and their nose wrinkles. You don't have to say as much. So I cut about half the dialogue.
one difference I noticed is that the scenes in the play flow one to the next much more fluidly. It's more difficult to mark where one scene ends and another begins, whereas in the screenplay for the film, it was more episodic.
Right. It just suggested itself. It was easier to mark the time periods that way.
And how long did it take you to write that screenplay? Well, let me start over. How long did it take you to write the play and then the screenplay?
Well, I'm an odd writer. It takes me a long time to write the first page. Months. Between the first page and the last page, a couple of months. Not much. I have to get the motor going. Sometimes that can take a year. Same with screenplays. I have to oil it up to make it work. And then at the end, it just comes rushing out. Just the way I built.
And the screenplay was the same?
Same
sort of process.
progression.
I'm interested in the reaction of your audiences to Driving Miss Daisy, especially the reaction based on maybe the racial composition of your audiences. Did white audiences or black audience members react differently? Did Jewish viewers react differently than non-Jewish viewers?
Nothing happened when the play was going, but after the film was out and it was so successful, there was a lot of black backlash. And a lot of people saying this is a Southern paternalistic fantasy. It never could have been this way. And it was that way. I was writing about the truth. So I just decided not to pay any attention to it. And I was asked to write an op-ed piece for the Times defending it, and I said, no, my movie speaks for itself. And that's all past now. And the wonderful black actors like James Earl Jones and Morgan Freeman have told me what a rich experience it is to play the part in Miss Daisy, and that's enough for me.
And you based the character of Miss Daisy on your grandmother.
Correct.
And the driver
was her driver. Right.
So is the play to you more a memoir than a fiction? Or?
Oh, yeah. It's more a memoir than a fiction. It's kind of what really happened. I mean, I changed things around a little bit. I made her, in truth, my grandmother lived with us. And she didn't have a house by herself. So that was all changed around, but the relationship developed like that.
How did your family react to the play?
Well, unfortunately, my grandmother was gone. The driver was gone. My mother loved it. My family was overjoyed.
Good. Was there of course, I shouldn't ask questions like this, but was there a person in your family that was the basis for Bully?
Yeah, me. I made it up. My grandmother didn't have a son, so I was writing me and my mother, kind of.
I mean, the relationship between Bully and his mother, it's one of love, but it's also one of irritation.
Yeah, right.
A constant kind of struggle.
Right. That was kind of my relationship with my mother. There was a constant flow of love under it all. But we were not people who were demonstrative. My mother never kissed me, or I mean, she would have, but she would never vent in a conversation saying "I love you" or something like that. It was not like that. I knew that she did. She knew that how I felt.
Your 3 plays, Driving Miss Daisy and Last Night at Ballyhoo and Parade, I've seen them sort of described as your Atlanta trilogy. Were they conceived in that way?
Not at all. I didn't think of that at all. I think it's just that in my heart I go back to Atlanta and my childhood when I want to dig deep. It's just the way it is.
So what was it? I grew up in Atlanta during the 50s and 60s. I was on the south side. You were on the north side. But what was your experience growing up in Atlanta like? How has it sort of affected your work?
Well, I went to Druid Hill School, and I would say my teenage was a lot like the movie Diner. I like going out with the guys and sitting around and talking about girls, and but plus it was very Southern, and although I was not disliked, I was not in the in crowd really because I was a Jew. I wasn't athletic, so I didn't play football or anything like that. I was like the class clown, sort of. But I was not an unhappy boy. And I loved the movies, I loved the theater. And I had a very sort of middle-class suburban childhood, which is what it was.
There's a scene in Ballyhoo where the character Sonny remembers basically being thrown out of a pool.
Yes.
That was not open to Jewish people.
Yes.
Did you have similar?
Exactly happened to my sister. Mm-hmm. And I kept the same name of the pool in the play, the Venetian swimming pool. Yes, it happened to my sister when she was about 10 years old. Exactly that.
And was that something you ran into more often than not? Was it?
It was always there. Mm-hmm. It was always the shadow. Always something could come out and somebody would say dirty Jew or kike or something. It was there.
And yet, would you characterize your life in Atlanta as one that was more negative than positive or positive than negative? Or do you look back with it on fondness, or do you look back with it on, gladness that it's passed?
Both. It was a life. It was like any kid's life, I think. It wasn't a golden period, but it was, I was a happy boy with these shadows following me around. I wasn't miserable.
So when I read Driving Miss Daisy or The Last Night at Ballyhoo, and I have not had the opportunity to see Parade, there is this constant sort of struggle or tension going on between cultural and religious identity, but economic sort of struggles. And of course, in Miss Daisy, we become aware of an additional kind of tension in terms of race. But this seems to me to be, at least in these two plays, an important theme to you.
I think it is an important theme. How I think you're saying that I write about social class and what people want, and how social situations, social proprieties get in the way of what you want to do, and they shape how you feel about things. Yeah, I write about that.
What else do you think you write about? And by that I mean, what am I missing? What to you, when you think of those plays, what do they represent?
I'm afraid I don't know what you mean.
What themes do you feel, if you were in a class talking to a group of students?
I don't think I write themes. I think I write characters.
Okay.
And I don't think about themes. I think about how people behave and what really happens. And what I think, for instance, I don't think mostly people say what they mean. I think people often don't even know what they mean. They just say things. But way under what they say, you can tell how they feel. And I like the space between what you say and how you feel.
So themes come maybe from people like me who are sort of imposing explanations.
Right.
But they must also come from a sort of confluence of circumstances and events.
Right.
And
but I don't set out to
right.
explore a theme. I explore how people feel. That's what I really am interested in.
When you look back at your career, which is obviously still going on, what are you most pleased with?
Oh, I'm most pleased with that I'm still here, and that with the things that I write, like Ballyhoo, which was written almost 20 years ago, is still vibrant with kids. The parade has done a lot that Miss Daisy's done all the time, that I still work. I'm just glad I'm here and still doing it. I'm glad that people like what I did and do.
Well, I've appreciated the chance to talk with you,
You are very
maybe
welcome.
I'll give you the opportunity to talk about anything that I haven't brought up.
I think you covered it right pretty well. I think that I have learned you have to write about something you really care about, even if it's a trivial thing, even if it seems foolish. If it's something you really feel about, you can write about it. But I don't think you can set out to write about the great issues. I think you can write about how people deal with the great issues, or with the small ones, but how people behave is what floats my boat.
Thank you, and I've
Thank
enjoyed
you.
this conversation.
I did too. Thanks a lot.